did not have that much of a sports career as a child in my life. What's funny enough is the sport that I probably cared about the least amount was the one I played the most. But I spent a lot of time in my life playing basketball, either in somebody's carport or in church league basketball. That's where my career began and ended. And the only crowning achievement was my junior year of high school. When my coach realized how bad of a basketball player I was, he taught me how to set a pick. And then I spent the entire season being the preacher's kid who technicaled out of every single game because I thought setting picks was really, really fun. It's like the one job for a fat guy on a basketball team. But there's, when you're a kid and you're playing like pickup basketball, and I feel like growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, like you played a lot of carport basketball. Like every kid had that basketball goal. The dad had to concrete it in the ground. You didn't have those removable plastic things yet. So like when you moved, you had to leave your basketball goal there. This is also back before, do you remember how you used to have to raise them by those two bolts? And so you couldn't pick it up. So like raising the basketball goal took like 4 people. But you played a lot of like carport basketball. And in carport basketball, there's always like the one kid in the neighborhood who's really good at basketball. But there's also that one kid in the neighborhood who's like really bad at basketball, but is also kind of a punk. And he'll call fouls all the time. And basketball is kind of a unique game because like fouls actually matter because you can shoot free throws. And oddly enough, that kid who was always the one calling too many fouls, that was also a punk, was also the kid who had beef with everybody in the neighborhood. And then he was also the kid that practiced free throws a lot at his house. Because he could be, he wasn't a team player. They never were team players. I mean, when you're playing carport basketball, like you're on teams of 2 or 3, like team dynamics are kind of important here. But like he'd always like get in fights, start stuff, call a foul. But he realized if that kid could get to the free throw line, he became a valuable asset. That free throw allowed him to find value as a player without depending whatsoever at all on his team. That he could do what he needed to do without depending on other people. I came across this article last week. I'm going to show up just one single image from it. There was about 7 things the church needs to be more aware of in our current culture. And the number one thing, it said this: we're becoming more aggressive and more sensitive. What it has in the blue is this: the people most likely to insult others are the first to be offended by even the smallest expressions of opposition. Like, we've got a disagreement problem in our culture now. Would anybody say that we don't have a disagreement problem? And many times we get into this, the issue is we think the best place we can get to is to simply agree to disagree. How many times have you used that phrase? Well, we'll just agree to disagree. But what kind of world is it where agreeing to disagree is the best option? Like, what actually happens if the best thing you can hope for is simply to agree to disagree? We've got a disagreement problem, and we rarely have the ability to know what a disagreement without leading to an argument is like. I think it's becoming rarer and rarer that we know what a disagreement with that leads to a positive outcome is like in our life. Because everything in our culture is hurtling exactly against that. But what would happen if the typical reaction to a disagreement was a better relationship? To some of us, and sometimes in my own life, that seems so outlandish, I don't even believe it to be true. But what would the world be like if disagreements typically led to stronger relationships? Today we're going to look in Scripture, Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to look at just a portion of this, and it's about disagreements. But before we read this, I want you just to think about one thing. I want you to listen to this, and I want you to just ponder who sounds more important in this: the person or the larger whole? And just to think about that as I read this. Matthew chapter 18, verse 15 through 18. This is what Scripture tells us. If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. And if the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. But if you are unsuccessful, take 1 or 2 others with you and go back again, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. And if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. I also tell you this, if two of you agree here on earth concerning anything you ask, my Father in heaven will do it for you. For where 2 or 3 gather together as my followers, I am there among them. So you are better than a disagreement. This passage at first, it sounds kind of wild. That the kind of like thing in the middle that we're just going to kind of circle around today is when it says if one person sins against another. Like that immediately kind of like makes us think about what's actually going on here. Is this just like your typical personal beef, or is this something more serious? Now, what Jesus is outlining here is a common practice in the synagogue 2,000 years ago. The synagogue was the center of Jewish life. Like every town had at least one synagogue, if not more synagogues. In many ways, like when we think of churches now, so much of that early example comes from the synagogue. And you were members of a synagogue. You had a place there. You belonged there. So Jesus is just outlining what disagreements look like. Everything he just said would have been familiar to the people who heard it. They're like, oh yeah, we know this pattern, Jesus. But he takes this and he expands it. And then the first thing, it talks about if a believer sins against you. You know, this word believer, it's not talking about faith adherence or membership. It's talking about the bond that you have with another person. The exact word comes from someone of the same womb. Like if you grew up in church or you've watched like TV and stuff, you know, there's the kind of cliche brother, sister that you hear in church. Like it comes from this understanding. That the people that you're in spiritual relationship with should be close to you as kin. That's the relationship that you see here. And the second thing Jesus is talking about the church. You know, when I first started reading this a few weeks ago, I was like, church, what's Jesus talking about church for? Like okay, we don't hear him talk about church that much. But what he's referring here to this spiritual community, these people that you are in relationship with for the purpose of growing closer to God and growing as a person. These are the people that you've willfully placed yourself in a spiritual relationship alongside of. So that kind of then tightens it up. So it's not just like an argument with a random stranger. It's now an argument with somebody who you feel really close to, that you've intentionally placed yourself in a relationship with. And then the last thing he talked about, if they sin against each other, you know, what is sin? I mean, what does this say about this? I talked to a couple people about this last week saying, hey, what does this mean to you? And the kind of common denominator was, well, I guess if somebody breaks a 10 commandment against you, like if someone covets what I have, or if someone lies, or if someone steals, or someone disrespected their father and mother, if you're younger here today, you hear that used a lot. Or if you're older, you might use that on your own kids some. Like, what does that mean? And if we really look at this, though, if you kind of look at the way that Jesus was like, that God was like shaping these rules with the Jewish people in the Old Testament, but also more specifically, the way Matthew talks about sin, is that that sin really is defined in terms of a broken relationship. It's a broken relationship that we have with God. Because of sin, that relationship is broken. Jesus heals that relationship. But it's also the broken relationship we can have with other people. So in that terms, when someone willfully does something to break a relationship, it is possible there. Okay, so this is how we can sin against each other. It's this willful breaking of a relationship, or doing something that's so deliberate that we're hidden from and we can't even see ourselves. The way Jesus talks about sin in Matthew is broken relationship with God and a broken relationship with other people. You either don't see how you're not following God, or you don't see how you are hurting and hampering the life of someone else. Broken relationships lead to broken ability. So what does this mean to us now? Like, okay, Chad, we understand this, but like, what does this mean to us now? I want us just to think about our own actions. Think about what's happened. Think about what this would look like in your life. What it means is we're realizing that spiritual behaviors can sometimes have huge consequences from a good perspective or from a bad perspective. That we can, that just made me hungry. This is spiritual behavior. Spiritual behaviors can impact the bigger picture. No, without a doubt. Hey, okay, sidebar. One time I was at a tiny church in Kentucky I worked at, and the pastor's cell phone rang, and it was the Cops theme song. And he answered it during the sermon, and it was his granddaughter, and it straight went like this. Like, bad boys, bad boys. He finally answered, I'm preaching a sermon right now. I'll call you back. So it happens to everybody. Don't worry about that. But like, we can see how our positive behavior can affect the bigger picture, right? But what about when our negative behavior affects the bigger picture? Now, just this morning, I was thinking about this, kind of doing my last run through and realizing, if you spend time reading scripture, there's a couple behaviors we hear about a lot. And this is why gossip is such a big deal. This is why being a hypocrite, like those sorts of things are such a big deal, because we now see, hey, this is how relationships can be broken. This is how I can negatively affect the bigger picture of the people that I'm in a spiritual relationship with. This is not a personal beef that we might have. This is something that's dangerous to other people and dangerous to the mission at hand. Sin is a relational issue. This whole passage is wrapped up in relationships. Think about it. Like, if you're willing, like if someone's going to come to you and say, hey, listen, we need to talk about something, would you not say that you would have a relationship with that person? Like, if we're going to follow this out to the T, I imagine, I'm going to be honest with y'all. I'm only going to have that conversation with somebody I know well. Like, I'm not going to be like, even in my role now, I'd feel tremendously awkward going to somebody who I don't know well to have a conversation about a negative issue. And if we're going to have even a hope of this happening and understanding, then both of those people are going to be in relationship. So the confrontation point has relationship, but then the restoration point has relationship. This whole thing is wrapped up in strong relationships. This isn't, hey, I've got a problem with you. This is, hey, I really care about you, and I'm worried about something. This whole thing is wrapped up in relationships. So if sin's a relational issue, the restoration should be a relational issue. One of the things I've been reading a lot about right now is some sociologists talking just about the danger points that we are in as a culture, and what many of them talk about using different languages, but it's kind of the same idea, is that this idea of we have a couple of three buckets that run us as a culture. And one of those buckets is our freedom bucket, or our individual bucket, or our individualism bucket. And they say that in Western culture, specifically in America right now, that bucket is overflowing. But then we also have this responsibility bucket. This social bucket, this relationship bucket. And they said that we are in a drought with that bucket right now. Like, our individual bucket is overflowing while our relationship bucket hardly has anything in it right now. Like, we've got a problem with individualism right now in our culture. And that happens here in the church too, because the issue is we want to go at it alone. How many of you have self-described or been described by others as, I'll just take care of it myself? Friends, I'm a I'll take care of it myself type person, and that threw me in the hospital 3 months ago. That kind of thing will kill you. But we want to go at it alone, even in church. And that's part of just this broken life and broken world that we have to confront and to talk about of our spiritual behaviors, that we have a natural disposition to go at it alone. And that's not how Jesus designed us to be. Jesus designed us to be working inside of relationships and working inside of community. We all want to matter, but we also struggle in allowing others to matter at the same time. Think about what kind of witness the church can give of allowing everyone to matter together at the same time. Allowing everyone to grow into the fullest picture of who they are at the same time. See, this changes the whole reason behind the confrontation, doesn't it? Like, this used to be a passage of scripture that I really didn't want to deal with because I'd seen it abused and weaponized at times before. But this changes things when we realize that this is about the relationships that we have with people. See, you're bigger than a disagreement. There are two things that Jesus lifted up as important inside of this. And the first one is this, is the community is paramount. You know, it's interesting, like the second layer of this confrontation, Jesus says, take a couple of folks with you to go and talk to this person. Then also at the end of this passage, he says, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am present. So the same group of people that manifest the presence of God is the same group of people that are called into on this. That the community significantly matters is an entire part of the process. You know, disagreements get dangerous. When was the last time you saw a disagreement get out of line and out of whack and destroy a situation? That's that's one of the parts of adulthood they don't tell you about when you're a kid. When you see that happen among good people and good intentioned people sometimes. Because, I mean, this isn't about bad action. This isn't about like a person having a beef with somebody else and saying, I don't like the way, this really annoys me and aggravates me. But instead, this is about us refusing to see our actions that might lead other people to brokenness, that might lead other people to dangerous situations and might cause division. It's also about us as the church, though, and us as people and those that we're in relationship with, saying that, okay, if we leave things unchecked, what if this causes further damage and further harm? And then we if we allow that, instead of saying we're going to follow this biblical pattern of restoration, not of conflict, but of restoration. The community to Jesus is paramount. And the next thing is that forgiveness is key. And the third part of this, Jesus says, if the whole church comes to them and they don't recognize that, then you should treat them as a pagan or a tax collector. You know, the funny thing is, this is the only time in all the Gospels where Jesus talks negatively about tax collectors. Earlier this year, I said that I really think tax collectors are Jesus' favorite sinners. Like, they're the ones he's always with. Like, they're the ones the Pharisees like complain about. So I don't think Jesus I think Jesus is saying, hey, these are the people that I love, that I care about, that I'm going after more and more and more. What this doesn't mean is if someone continues to break a relationship, you should cast them out. What he's saying is you should realize that how important they are to bring back into the fold. I mean, how many times have we had a broken relationship where we cease contact with that person? And then you have that awkward dance of like you're in a restaurant and you see them and you kind of, let me get behind this pillar real quick. I mean, we laugh because we've done it before. What is it like to love people, even in their bad decisions? So Jesus brings up the people that he seems to love the most almost inside of this. You know, Peter, right after this passage, I'll tell you, if you have some time this afternoon, just go home and read all of chapter 18 because it puts this little section even more into realization. But right after this, Peter says, Jesus, you know, what if I forgive somebody 7 times and they still don't like start behaving? And Jesus' response is, you need to forgive them 70 times 7 times. That's like first century Jewish math for infinite. Like you need to give them all the forgivenesses. That's the way that you need to act. Like forgiveness is key. And we've got the responsibility in our lives to create peaceable kingdom in all of our spheres of influence, all the places that we are, all the places that we can be. Jesus has given us the responsibility to be a people of forgiveness no matter what. Even if things are continually, willfully broken, we've got the responsibility to enact forgiveness. So what's at stake here? In this passage, there's a kind of a weird section. I think this is where Jesus tells us why this should matter to us personally, but also should matter to us as a church. Verse 18, this is what it read. And it's kind of weird sounding. But I tell you the truth, whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, and whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. Now, that's in the New Living Translation. If we go to kind of more of an older, more literal translation, it says this. I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. You know, Jesus in other places in the Gospels, whenever this binding and loosing language comes up, he's talking about exorcism. He's talking about what are the things that you realize that you have to tie down and control. And what are the things that you realize that you have to loose and unleash? What are the bad things that you need to limit? And what are the good things that you need to allow to expand? And I think Jesus brings this up inside of a conversation about forgiveness because he needs for us to understand that we will have as much of God's kingdom as we are willing to experience. That if we allow broken and destructive behavior in our own life to flourish, or in the lives of those that we are in a deeply committed relationship with, for that to allow it to happen, then that we are limiting the ability that we can see Jesus and his kingdom on this earth. That if we realize this is very dangerous to us, this is dangerous to that person, and this is dangerous to what God is calling us to do. The brokenness that we allow will limit our degree to experience and fully realize what forgiveness looks like. But that forgiveness is that thing that we should unleash. He's telling Peter, we need to forgive at a level that is uncomfortable to us. To forgive to a level that seems limitless. So let me ask you this now. So is agree to disagree enough? If that's our hoped for outcome in tough situations, is that enough? Or is that limiting the amount that we can experience Jesus? See, what's a more powerful witness? What would attract other people? Think about this. If we as individuals have a history of broken relationships behind us, or we as people have a string of healthy, whole, and healed relationships, in spite of disagreements, in spite of seeing things differently, if we have a group of people around us that we are committed to living life with, and that we realize that we're different, but that we're together. See, we are only as strong as our weakest ability to forgive. That's us as people, as individuals, and that's us as a church. Now, the greatest experience of forgiveness that we have is our personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that will set the ceiling for what forgiveness looks like for us. That if we struggle with understanding Jesus and how he forgives us, we will probably struggle with explaining and offering forgiveness to other people. Our relationship with Jesus and our understanding of his forgiveness will set our ceiling for forgiveness. We're bigger than a disagreement. And if Jesus is big enough for forgiveness, then we should be big enough for forgiveness.